I'd like to I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar, Preparing for the Unthinkable, Lessons from Lewiston, Maine. My name is Savannah Blance Maria. I'm the programs coordinator here at Connecticut Main Street Center. In a moment, I will introduce today's speaker, but first we have just a few words. Connecticut Main Street Center is the expert resource for developing and sustaining vibrant downtowns and main streets that fuel our state's prosperity. We are grateful to our sponsors and funding partners that make this work possible. Connecticut Main Street Center's founding sponsors are Eversource and the State of Connecticut Department of Economic and Community Development. Additional funding comes from Webster Bank, Travelers, and Liberty Bank. We all know a great downtown when we're in it. It's a feeling and energy that we can sense, see, and experience, but it can be hard to articulate what exactly makes a Main Street great. So we've broken it down into 6 qualities that make it easier to grasp. There is always dedicated Main Street management. The Main Street is connected by multiple modes of transportation for people to access. It's welcoming, friendly, and inclusive. Sustainable practices are in place that bring life and vibrancy for today and for the future. Small businesses are supported and encouraged, as well as residential and commercial development. And there is a unique sense of place. And with that, I am excited to introduce our guest speaker, Shanna Cox, President and CEO of the Lewiston Auburn Metropolitan Chamber of Commerce. With that, I'll pass it over to you now, Shanna.
Thank you, Savannah. Hi, everyone. I really appreciate you taking time to join us for a conversation that is certainly a little bit more challenging. I'm going to share my screen with the slides. Does that sound good to you, Savannah?
Yes.
There we go. So I want to set the scene a little bit. I know that sitting here about a year and a half after a major event that really changed my operations, the work that we do here at the Chamber, the way that we think about events, and the way that we think about community and economic recovery. If you had asked me 2 years ago if I would want to spend even an hour of my time talking about this conversation, I probably would have said no. So the fact that so many of you have made time today for a conversation that is a little bit hard, I really, really want to appreciate and thank you. There's some questions that I'll address. Some of you submitted in advance. Thank you. If you have questions as we go, don't hesitate to put them in the chat box. Savannah's going to help lift them up for me. I'm going to go a little bit quick in the front just to set the scene of what our experience was here so that there's some context for you. And then I really do encourage you to engage as we move into some of the recommendations and kind of the meat and potatoes of what you probably came for today. So Lewiston, Maine is by population density, it's in southern Maine, but it is halfway in Maine's population. We're about 30 minutes north of Portland, Maine. And on October 25th in 2023, you probably saw national news get made here in my own home community. And so at that time, we had the first mass casualty, mass shooting event in Maine's history ever. It was the second deadliest in the year of 2023. And these are what the headlines looked like as the incident happened. Just from one event organizer to so many others, we did have 2 events going on in our community, one that we were participating in and a second that we were hosting in. And so keep that in mind as I walk you through some of the headlines that tell the story of what we went through. So not only did we have a shooting, and the shooting started at a family bowling alley, bar, pub, restaurant, but then the shooter actually left that location, went to a second location, also a family kind of pool hall, darts, pub establishment. But then the shooter was able to leave that establishment and was not to be found for 3 days. And that, in terms of events like this, it's very rare that somebody who perpetrated the crime leaves the crime, let alone commits it again. And so not only did we have the immediate impact to these 2 businesses, but we spent, the better part of 3 days sheltering in place, not just in a community, but frankly, across the county and the state. It ended 3 days later, and I use ended a little bit liberally because in so many ways it's not done for us in our community. But it ended 3 days later after the suspect was found in a community about 20 minutes from the actual initial locations. So a lot of people followed along with headlines like this. We did reopen one of the businesses. The second business will not ever reopen. And so there was a lot of community support to get to a place where just-in-time recreation reopened. This is the two owners. That's Sam on the left and Justin on the right. They had a ton of community support. In fact, had some congressional and mayoral support in the background of this picture. And that almost never happens in incidences where a business or a location in a community has had an active shooting. So that was a good moment, but in the reality, what we were seeing in the background is the lingering economic impacts of what had happened here. And so headlines like these that started to talk about businesses that were closing became more and more current as the year approached. So in January of 2024, in fact, it made Slate and national news again. Our Main Street and downtown businesses were some of the most impacted, specifically in the hospitality industry. And you can see here in this one comment by this upscale restaurant that had opened, maybe 6 months prior to the shooting event. You see in that bottom right-hand box, he says, the reality is our timing was like we opened, and then there was a mass shooting. And I lift this up because there's implications for this, not just in how we plan. Okay, Savannah.
Yep, go ahead. Thank you.
How's that?
Thank you. That's perfect.
Yeah, no, thank you for lifting up that it had slipped away. I think we were here with this comment from the business owner, which just followed. So 5 months of business closings being essentially a new headline every week, which was really speaks to what we were seeing in our economy. And so that kind of sets the stage of what was and did happen here in Lewiston. I want to talk a little bit about the roles that we played in the immediate aftermath. And then I'll share kind of the lessons learned. But there are some lessons to be taken around these roles being roles that are necessary to respond to an event. It might not be your organization or you that is holding these roles, but many of these roles, I would say very candidly, are not traditional roles that you would expect a chamber to take. And many of those roles we took because there were not clear leadership, clear expectations, or clear agreements or plans that set those roles up to be managed in a more distributed way or in a way that might align with assumptions that you might have around roles in community. And so it's helpful to think about some of the key roles and functions that we identified in the response and after. And so there's a need for communications. The shelter-in-place order impacted businesses and their ability to open, their ability to ask their employees to come in. It also impacted deliveries. So there was 3 days where we weren't getting deliveries of food to restaurants or hotels in our community. So there's some basic communications that need to happen outside of the safety and police communications, if that makes sense. We were one of the primary organizers for the vigil that our community had. It was about 4,000 people that came together on the first day that the shelter-in-place order was lifted. We did support a lot of fundraising and donor advisement efforts, including strong relationships with our philanthropic partners and sharing information about what options were available there. I know that I'm seeing some comments. Don't hesitate to lift up or vocalize any of the questions that you're seeing, Savannah. Part of the way we met this need was we did prop up a website within 24 hours where we could add information, provide updated information, provide links. We also provided a lot of resources, including active shooting plans and trainings that our businesses could use as they prepared to come back because there were so many concerns. I would say the response period was probably the 4 days after the immediate event when there was some relief, knowing that the shooter was no longer active or available to our community and that we weren't in danger. And then we started the recovery phase. And I would just be really clear that recovery is still ongoing in this region. We continue to do fundraising, donor advisement, and philanthropy work. We continue to update and add information to the onelewiston.org site. We also did a really unique role of providing some direct victim and survivor as well as first responder support with some of the funds that we had received to address immediate needs like paying rent or mortgage or car insurance, keeping cell phones on and houses heated. That was a role we didn't expect to play and was important and necessary. Resilience is the phase I like to think that we are moving through and into. This is the ongoing stage that we're at currently, which includes a lot of regional marketing efforts, creating a new narrative and addressing some of the bad publicity that we got for days on end in a 24-hour ticker banner way. We've had to do specific business support. Some of that is making information available about physical changes or training changes that businesses can make to address, much like you are today, thinking about how they would handle this if it happened again. And then there is some ongoing fundraising efforts to help establish a permanent memorial in our community. Just kind of briefly, these are by the numbers to give you a sense of it, but we managed all of these different funds. Each of these funds, except for the Small Business Relief Fund, that last bullet, were funds that we managed on behalf of other people, and then we managed those funds and dispersed those funds based on the desire and agreements made with the primary donors. The Small Business Relief Fund we raised for our businesses to provide grants. And so just kind of by the numbers, it was $1.4 million specific to victim and survivor needs. That looked like a fund for a former governor that supported more than 31 individuals with direct disbursements. There were 162 individuals present and impacted between the two sites that night. There was a softball tournament that raised a bunch of money and supported the next of kin of the families who lost somebody, and then a little bit of support for folks who had also been shot that day. The Credit Union League had a mission around food and food security already, so their food focus was what we supported, and that looked like funds for gatherings at our resiliency center that supports those directly impacted. A local food pantry who did stay open kind of against the policies of sheltering in place to feed our unhoused neighbors and community members, and then supporting first responders and survivors directly. Our city, the city of Lewiston and its municipality, and we're not a municipal-based organization, we helped raise and manage about $280,000 out of a larger kind of $1 million plus pool. And that's the funds in which we supported the direct needs of survivors. And so that looked like housing, transportation, utilities, heating, some medical, not medical costs, but adaptive beds and ramps were some of what we supported in that piece. The Small Business Relief Grant is the only item that we participated in for fundraising, of which we were the only determinant of how those funds would be used, how they'd be solicited. And it was important to us to get money directly to businesses that had lost business. I would assume that many of you with Main Street affiliations have a large number of hospitality-based businesses in those areas. Because these incidences happened at hospitality businesses, my hospitality sector was seeing a 60% year-over-year loss in the 3 and 4 months directly following this, which is their biggest season. It's the holiday season where they expect to make some of the money that sustains them through that kind of January and February dip. So the impact was very real and really hollowed out. A number of those headlines that I shared that had businesses closing were on our downtown Main Street location. So we granted, at this point, it's actually a little higher than that, about $690,000. We continued to raise, and our full funding now is about $780,000. And some of that has been designated towards marketing, both for hospitality and for the community as a whole. We did celebrate Just in Time's reopening May 3rd, and this is what you might have seen on the news here in the top left. This is the view that I had down below. It was a room full of people, and that's just on the lane sides. There's probably 500 people in attendance that day. A lot of that's our governor helping cut the ribbon, and a lot of community members as well as survivors. And I think That moment gave folks a lot of hope for what recovery and resilience might look like. These are just some examples of the marketing efforts that we put forward. And then the ongoing efforts that we continue to do is to chair a resiliency committee, organize and convene that group of people focused on building a permanent memorial. We hosted the one-year commemoration event. That's the photo on this slide. And then really to plan this longer term permanent memorial, which takes anywhere between 5 and 7 years on average. Trish has a question. Trish, I don't know if our setting allows me to hear you, but I'd love to hear your question. Savannah, are we going to let people talk? Oh, go ahead.
Trish, if you have the ability to come off mic, if not, you can go ahead and post it into the Q&A or the chat, but I haven't seen anything come through yet.
Okay.
I think Trish should be able to unmute and talk.
Okay.
It's to unmute.
Trish, if you're trying and it's not working, throw it in the chat box so we can see
Okay,
it.
she's unmuted now.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Trish. Did you have a question?
Maybe not.
Okay. I welcome them. There are some.
Okay, we'll let you know.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. There are some ongoing fund management activities that we're in. And so that's a quick lay of the land. This is the stage and the part of our commemoration event on the 1 year anniversary of the incident from October 25th. Some folks might not know, and this is actually something to consider as you think about what it is to respond to or recover from something like this in your community. More than a third of the people who were directly impacted are part of our deaf and hard of hearing community. And we've had to learn a lot about access to information and inclusivity at events, and really to think about that through a very different lens. And so this commemoration event was held, and half of the speakers are from the deaf community. Interpretation was consistent throughout. And I was really proud of this event, how we did, but it took a lot of learning and building some new skills for us and many in our community during this process. So I want to talk a little bit about the lessons learned and some of the takeaways that will help you all think about what you might take away from this conversation and apply in your work. The emergency management system, and somebody had given a really great advanced question. How was regional emergency management engaged before and after the event? I've gotten more confident talking about this over the last year, but very candidly, it was not. Our safety response, so police, sheriff, state police, there was a coordinated response effort among our safety agencies. But if you've ever had an experience with really needing emergency management, calling in the EMA system, usually to a flood or some kind of natural event, that system and that plan was not called on. The roles described in that plan were not actively used by some of the agencies that have roles in that plan during this incident. And that was something that I followed up with our emergency management folks afterwards to try to understand what would normally happen, who would be engaged, what role, if any, our organization would have, and at what point we would engage that. And we found out that the emergency management plan did not specifically name a man-made disaster, and so it was assumed to not be applicable. So I think one of the biggest opportunities for you all is to ask the question, what's our emergency management plan look like regionally in our area, and does it address a man-made incident? And if not, how do we proactively assure that it is? And there was another question around planning, and I think this is one of the most important things that you could think of, because we found ourselves playing roles that others are better equipped to do and have more familiarity in doing, and simply weren't in this incident because it was the first time that it had happened. So I would name that as a specific piece to be asking about and preparing in advance. Have a plan. Make sure your emergency management plan specifically speaks to any man-made casualty. And then be clear about what your role is in it, or the key roles that you would need to coordinate with, and make sure you're in conversation with them before you ever need to be. Fundraising is a really significant role. You need a 501c3. The chamber that I oversee is a 501c6 traditional lobbying chamber, but we do have another C6 and then also a C3 subsidiary. And because some of our work has been workforce related and some barrier removal, it is why we have the systems and the ability to both receive funds and support the fundraising effort, but also to provide some direct support to families and survivors in the weeks directly following. So whether you are a 501c3, whether you're prepared to start a fund or not, be clear on who is, and if it's you, what role you'd be willing to have. There is risk involved. There's scrutiny involved with managing funds. We had to have some really honest conversations with our board and our executive committee about risk tolerance and about mission. And I was really fortunate to have a wonderful board that showed courage and leadership. But this was a role that ended up being very vital to being able to serve our businesses as well as those directly impacted. Relationships were what made things work. In the days when there was no clarity, and I think I was working 22-hour days, taking cat naps until he was found, and being able to understand what my businesses were going through, what the financial loss was with an evacuation in the middle of a dinner rush, for example. Relationships to my members, to my businesses were really key, but the relationships that I either had or strengthened and developed with key partners whom I might not have had in place at all. So our Attorney General's office is a key relationship that we built that allowed us to do the work that we did with confidence and knowing when we were being compliant. And most of that work was relationship based, almost everything that we did. And it was not by title. It was the leadership that we saw in this region were people who were able to lead, who were able to manage the trauma and the crisis of the moments that we were in. And that oftentimes did not align with clear agency roles or clear titles of positions of authority. And so relationships were just vital, just really vital to make this work. You'll see me kind of hit on that again in some recommendations. And then communication and information flow was just one of the areas that was not coordinated. There was not a lot of planning around. There was a need for communication that went beyond the reporting that the police department and the state police were doing. And as it turned out, in our kind of community level hindsight, many of the communications that were going out in those 3 or 4 days were not accessible to the deaf community. We weren't using best practices for ASL interpretation. There was not written text alerts that could get through any type of hearing disabilities. And so it's not just who will communicate, but how will you communicate, and how are folks going to be able to access that communication? That's why the coordinating website ended up being just so important for the success in that early stage. I'm gonna make some recommendations. These are things that I think will support you in thinking about what to take away from this. Some of them are at a community level. So, knowing and understanding what the emergency contact systems are and ensuring that that information is known and available to those in that system and to those who would access or need that system is really important. So maybe this lives somewhere in a public setting for folks to know where they get information, who they contact if they're concerned. There was a lot of coordination by relationships among business owners the night that it was happening. And because of that, there was also a lot of rumors. So the police, went and either evacuated or demanded kind of a shelter in place at a lot of similar type establishments as this was unfolding that evening. And you had patrons and chefs and dishwashers alike hiding in closets and in back staircases, police officers outside, and folks not knowing that the police were protecting the folks inside and not chasing a suspect. And so there was some very real kind of implications of that night. And there was a lot of informal communication among business owners. And so whether it's a Facebook group that you manage, or there is a chat or WhatsApp channel that you guys can support, think about the informal emergency contacts as well as the kind of more formal contact system. Tabletop drills might be something that you're familiar with. If you're not, let me introduce you. It's the opportunity to work with the actual individuals in the actual agencies that you would be working with in an incident. So if you are planning a Main Street summer festival that's going to shut down your Main Street for 2 days and it's going to engage thousands of people, the police department, the fire department, the head of your events planning, and other key relationships that are unique to your community can actually go through an exercise sitting around at a table and talk about how they would handle it if a call came in, who would make that call, what role your volunteers or staff might have in those pieces. And it not only helps you really experience what the steps are in a kind of low stakes setting, but it's also going to help you build understanding and relationships with those of whom you will have to coordinate with. So consider building that into your planning process. When a community is thinking about large events, and I know, ever since New Orleans, I think this has become even more prominent in the conversations that I have. But when you're looking at a very large event, like a shutdown of a street, we have a large balloon festival that happens here in our community. When you're planning a large event, oftentimes there's an event organizer, whether it's the municipality or another effort or community organization. And the planning kind of happens in there, and then there's some coordination of services. When you're doing that, be active in planning for these incidences. Where are your communication channels set up? For us, that was having real clear, distinguished lines around our walkie-talkies, who would be on which channels are emergency channel, how that relate to access that our police force and fire and EMT forces would have access to those channels. So there was some of that. It is also physical barriers. It's, emergency egress planning. When you're planning the large event, you should be planning it with community and not just for community. And we had spent years planning events kind of in a status quo, forward moving motion. And I will say every event that we planned last year, we really took a hard look at our event planning process, the event partners, and how we were having these conversations before the event began. Command and communication structures, there's a very specific structure that your emergency response teams will use that has a central command unit for all communications, and then it comes in and out. You can adopt that structure. You don't have to be on the police channel. You don't have to be the police department, but you can adopt that structure for the way your volunteers who are at the gates or at registration communicate with their lead person, and the way that your volunteers managing food can communicate with their lead volunteer management staff person, and then the way those leads communicate with each other to decision makers. There's a command structure that supports that. Your local police department might teach you a little bit about their structure and about how you can use it. And embracing that communication structure and format has helped us with our events and event efficiency when the biggest emergency that we're trying to deal with is the fact that the fourth shack ran out of hot dog buns. It really keeps the communication more coordinated and strategic. And so we actually have benefited from that structure in many other ways, not related to crisis. But it positions you and gives you practice at using the exact structure you want if your community is dealing with something unexpected, whether it's natural or man-made. And then lastly, your community needs to be thinking about fundraising preparedness. You might have a local community foundation or United Way that's kind of an easy suspect to start the conversation with. It might be you in your own scenario. You might be the only one fundraising for business. And so be thinking about who has qualified 501c3s, where there's fiscal agreements or sponsorship arrangements in place, or that could be, and think about what it is for your community to respond from a fundraising and philanthropic perspective. Any questions, Savannah, from the community recommendations so far before I keep moving forward?
Yeah, we just had one come in, and it says, are the notions of community and command and communication intention and planning for local emergencies? Is there a bridging mechanism or organization?
That's a really great question. If I think I understand it correctly, is there a bridge organization between the event command structure and the first responder command structure? I'll answer that question. If that's not quite it, just chime that into the chat box. I would say yes, and that goes back to the first and third bullet points on this slide. In an ideal world, you will learn about that structure in partnership with your local public safety. And if it's a large county-wide event, maybe it's your sheriff's department, and maybe it's your local municipal PD, maybe it's your state police. But they can teach you a little bit about that, and you can coordinate and determine in advance how you can replicate that structure in a way that makes sense for your communications within your event and what that bridge is. So we hold a river-based event. It's a river festival that has some like water sports and tournaments on the water. And while we have our own communication channels and our structure for our volunteers and staff, there is a specific channel of which our local fire department with its boat on the water is part of that structure, and they are the bridge. And so that's part of the agreement that we make going into an event, and based on the specifics of that event, who it might be. But yeah, you definitely want that structure to be known and comfortable, and then a specific understanding of how your structure bridges to an actual emergency response command structure. And it is very likely that your local public safety folks will be grateful that you understand that process and that a clear bridge is there and makes sense, because their 911 department might be getting dozens or hundreds of calls, and they should take that information. There might be good information in there, but fundamentally the folks responding to those 911 calls will already be in touch with a lead who already has the right communication channels to be the most in know, and that's a benefit to all parties. Did that seem to get at the question, Savannah?
I think so. And Dan, if that didn't answer your question, feel free to leave any clarifying points there. But it does sound like that collaborative approach is everything for creating these plans. And someone in the chat is asking, in addition to your slides, if you have any materials about your plan, or like your emergency contact system plan or document, they'd love to see it. We can talk about that offline as well, Shanna, of what we can share later.
Yeah, the slides have been given to Savannah, and they should be available to all of you in her follow-up. I wish I could give you a safety plan. I'd love to have our own emergency management plan updated. It's a pretty bureaucratic process. We're not a normal traditional bureaucratic stakeholder, so I'm still looking for those changes to be made locally, though I'd be more than happy to share when and if they ever come fully. I'll try to find some of the things. It's so unique by event what I could share relative to how we've incorporated some of this planning. But on the last slide, and probably separately in the follow-up, my email is made available to you. Don't hesitate to reach out. And God forbid you ever find yourself in a similar circumstance, don't hesitate to reach out then too. It was a big piece of how I survived, was talking to peers in Uvalde and Miami and Buffalo about what they had experienced and about what the months that followed looked like. There are far more of us out there than you would want to think. It's a large club that you don't look to join, but you're grateful there are other members of once you are initiated. Some recommendations for EMS or emergency management associations. You might or might not be on this call, and so to the extent that this is useful, but these are a couple of things that we recognize. Some of these roles were roles we ended up playing. And in our community, there was so this happened October 25th of 23. In December of 2023, there were significant floods in our downtown. insult to injury, if you will. And we watched our emergency management system work really well in that second incident. And so it was just a real clear opportunity to contrast and compare what a functioning response that's holistic and follows a plan looks like and what one that doesn't looks like. And so, to that extent, make sure that emergency contact system is in place. EMS folks should be doing that with their community organizers and event organizers. Likewise, if you're a community event organizer, be looking to understand who leads your emergency management response, and what those contacts and contact systems are. An SBA declaration was a really important piece. It unlocks a couple of funding mechanisms. Fundamentally, the best benefit is it gives EIDL, which is emergency impact declaration loans from the SBA, and makes them available. So low interest loans to businesses. Candidly, most of my businesses, particularly the ones impacted in this community, did not want loans, which is why we also did grants and a fundraising effort that supported grants. But that declaration is important for kind of unlocking some other things potentially for businesses in your community, as well as for your community response. And so figuring out how to initiate an SBA declaration of emergency for your community and who might do that and how you can help be part of that process. Just in the highlights, you need 11 businesses to declare a financial loss and impact. And so there's a specific form. You might have a role in working with your EMS and making that form available, collecting it and communicating them back. You might have a role in working directly with the SBA. When the SBA does declare, they need to come to town and have a no-cost contract where they can set up shop, and there's no fees charged to them for that. And they won't make the declaration until that's in place. So where might that be in your community, and how can you be prepared and willing to host the SBA as part of your preparations and thinking? Emergency response systems, contacts, and agencies have some great opportunity to train and educate community partners and event organizers on their systems, on their communication flows, on best practices, whether that's kind of more broadly or specific to an event and a location. I would say both but it is a recommendation to be asking for that from your emergency management system. I think it's really helpful. Learn that event command and communication structure and adopt it into the work that you're doing, and ask for that support and clarity. It's a little bit different in every community with the different resources and agencies that are there. So know what yours is and how you can bridge into it. That is it, guys. Let's bring you all back so I can see you in your chats there. That's the highlights of. It's a lot to absorb. Hopefully I broke down some of the different components and how it might impact you specifically, and you might think about it. I'm going to try to get caught up on some of the chat questions too. Yeah, Savannah, how did that work for you? Was there any theme before I backtrack in the thread?
That was great. And I encourage everyone, don't be shy. Please come into the chat or the Q&A and leave your questions. I think folks always love examples of best practices or knowing what other places and organizations are doing. So you shared that was wonderful. Yeah, I really encourage everyone, don't be shy into the chat. And I know we had some questions that came in advance, and you did incorporate them into the slides.
Yeah, want me to
so
see if there was one specifically I haven't been able to get to yet that wasn't like easily to incorporate. Do you want me to lift that one up as a starting?
Yeah, sure, go ahead. And we'll give a few minutes to get chatty in the chat.
Yeah. So somebody asked, how did we incorporate trauma and PTSD treatment in the response to the event? I love this question so much. So many ways. First of all, what I identified as an organizational leader, probably within a week of us, of the event itself, and then us really like picking up a lot of steam, shifting our operations to address our local community needs, is that I had 2 staff who were evacuated the night of the event from events they were hosting for members, volunteers, and community members they were responsible for, with police there. And so there were a couple folks who were directly impacted. Of our team of 11, all but 2 live within close proximity of these 2 sites. They were impacted, just sheltering in place and being concerned for their safety for 3 days, like so many others. So I supported some understanding of what a trauma response is to my staff, made some resources available to them, and then also did some team sessions. So very inherently, like it's the put on your air mask first before you support the person next to you on a plane. If we were going to be an organization that was going to sustain ourselves through an elongated response and resiliency effort, taking care of your team was like the first thing that I thought of as an organizational leader. Our vigil, our community vigil, housed about 1,500 people inside a basilica and another 3,000 people outside on the lawn. And then I don't know how many people we were able to stream it to in a bunch of different platforms, but thousands of people. And we made sure that there were therapy dogs on site, both inside and outside. We made sure there were creature comforts like blankets and water for people who were outside at the vigil. We had trauma therapists on site, and we had a therapy room available. So folks who might get kind of overwhelmed inside or outside could go into this more quiet, kind of sensory quiet space and work directly with therapists, talk to a dog, or just take a minute and regroup. That was really fundamental to the vigil itself. We repeated all of those same offerings when we did the 1-year commemoration event. And then, not our organization specifically, but there's been a lot of work to do trauma-informed care. Some of that's been educating providers about what a mass casualty event is and some of the pieces around that. There's been a lot of intentional efforts for first responders who were there that night, who we have also engaged and provided both support for them and some community education on the impacts that first responders and their families might see. So there's a number of ways that we did that. And then I would say, we're right now just at the cusp of building out the public engagement process for planning what a permanent memorial would look like, what functions it might serve. And those are things you might not have thought about before, but is it educational? Is it a reflective space? Is it indoors? Is it outdoors? We're building in trauma thinking into what we're asking, how we're engaging, the process by which we determine a permanent memorial in our community, and the memorial itself. So I would say you can't afford for it to not show up anywhere. Like it's kind of got to be just woven into every aspect of the work that you're doing. There was a budget question that I can lift up too. I'll see if there's anything new in the chat.
Sure. Let's do the budget question.
Yeah. So
Thank
somebody had
you.
asked, how have you seen these types of events affect budget for public safety or Main Street events? It is a negative impact, and it is a sizable impact, and it is across the board. So, as communities, I think until October 25th in Maine, the amount of police officers we had staffing an event, like we shut down a street, we have a beer garden, and the number of police officers were based on how many people might have too much to drink, right? So it's like 1 or 2 police officers post this event, and in other communities that I've done this presentation with or that I'm working with, they're looking at budgets that have doubled or tripled. So, expenses going from $10,000 or $12,000 to $80,000 in one community because of the type of response that they were planning. And so there's a very real budget piece. I also think this is a really important time to say, knowing that there are a whole bunch of different folks with different roles and different affiliations in the audience. What I am concerned that I've seen is that communities, the municipality itself and the structures that run the safety response in those communities, there's just kind of a passing on of that expense. And I think there is a real hazard in communities not thinking about the events that are being run as economic development events, and those municipalities not seeing a portion of those emergency and security expenses being borne and shared by the municipality and the events themselves, because those costs, as I have seen them coming in, particularly post New Orleans, those costs as they've come in are so significant that they could tank a budget for an event. They can make the event non-feasible and the event stop happening in communities, and the negative impact to the businesses, the vendors, the B2B relationships, the quality of life and talent attraction and retention and population growth goals that communities might have, you're going to see those really quickly if we don't figure out how we share the cost of and the desire to keep communities safe. And so I just want to name that really clearly. But yes, there's very real expenses. For our commemoration event, the security expense was quite large. We had, we prepared for about 3,000 people inside. We had 4 means of egress. We had some specific entrances that were just for survivors, and that kind of had a different sensory and trauma experience. And then the public at large, there was wanding in all of those sites. I mean, we started with a police plan that looked at like 20, 25 police officers. What we got to, in agreement with like planning the security plan with our police department and state police, was an outside security force that cost significantly less, that did a lot of the wanding, and then strategic use of police officers in different places. And so it's not too early. There is no such thing as too early to start those conversations and to look at what a security plan would look like, how that might be staffed by different agencies, and in some places contracted and thus less expensive support. But it's a really great question. You should expect there will be an impact, and you should start that conversation as soon as possible, for what that's worth. And I'm sorry to bring you that bad news. There's another couple of questions, and I'm sensitive to time. It seems like we're doing okay and could handle 1 or 2.
Yeah, we actually have a really good question that came in through the chat that I'd like to read to you. It says, "Thank you for your leadership on this topic. Now that you've lived through this experience and have built relationships, who would be your first call if faced with another disaster?"
Remember when I said relationships was core to some of this work? Her name is Kara Cookson, and she is the Director of Victim Services at the Office of the Attorney General of Maine. And she's a badass. She is. She's a really incredible leader. She's a strong leader. She is an ethical leader filled with complete integrity. And I think one of the hardest things to realize about the difference between how your community might deal with a flood or a fire on Main Street and what our community dealt with is it's a crime. I know that seems really obvious, right? Like acts of God, there's no one that you point the finger at, there's no one who picks up the bill. But to be really, really specific, if you have an event like this where there is a human who created the incident in some way, or more than one human, it is a crime, and everybody who was there are witnesses, technically witnesses, and get witness support and services, which you don't get from a flood. And the locations where it happened, whether it's inside someone's business or is a crime scene. And that means their business will be locked down. It means that there's a whole bunch of things that will happen about things that are removed as evidence. And it turns out that like really small switch that like is turned on or off, like man-made, not man-made, hugely impactful to timelines, to people you work with, to process, to what you can do, what you can't do, what you're required to do. It's a very significant impact for a very small, seemingly small piece of the overall picture. And so because this was a crime, and because our neighbors and community members were victims, and because our businesses who were just as much a victim of a crime were also a crime scene, having a really good communication structure. So if this happened again tomorrow, that's 100% who I would call. And then very, very honestly, and this goes to the trauma response, the second call would be to my therapist to say, oh God, here we go again. Because there was, 80-hour work weeks for like 4 months. There was very real personal impacts. These are people I care about in my community. The business owners were people I care about. And so if you're going to lead or support through something like this, like how do you sustain yourself is a very real piece. But yeah, Kara Cookson in a heartbeat. And here's why, like, not only is she just amazing, she had attended a conference 2 months before this happened, where her work workshop breakout sessions. She selected one that was specific to mass shootings. And she was the only, with no disrespect to so many peers in this state, she was the only one who had the information and clarity of mind to bring that thinking forward, to say we're not alone, to pull forward resources or contacts and expertise from other community, because it's such a unique scenario. None of us were thinking about it like it was a crime. None of us were thinking about the implications because of that. And she had just enough information to know that she didn't know all the things, and know where she might get some of that other information. And that is why she was such an incredible leader in this work. It's a really good question, Jennifer. It's a really good question.
It sounds like she's been a lifeline through the like healing process. Yes.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, for any of you who are in this work, leaders or otherwise, those 2 or 3 people that you can talk with offline to be real honest about the week that you've had, to be real honest about the place that you're stuck and how you can get unstuck and kind of get outside your own perspective. There are the people in role that my role would coordinate with, and there was dozens of those. And then there were the people I worked with who moved that work. And that happened in informal spaces. And a couple of really interesting patterns for what that's worth that arose. We have a rising professionals group that we support, a young and rising professionals group. They're all under 40. Our younger community members, business leaders, and employees stepped up and led in this work. And I don't know if that's a reflection of them having grown up in a society that always had gun violence, and they just had a different perspective, but their leadership was incredible. They were a huge part of how we were able to pull off the vigil in 32 hours. 32 hours to have live streamed, closed caption, network, pool, security, all of those trauma supports, a venue, AV, like all of the things you do in an event. We did it in 32 hours. Wild. It was like, to look back, and we did it because they were able to step up. I also saw a significant amount of women leading, because this just was there's just so much emotionally that you need to be sensitive for, that you need to have an awareness of, the ability to manage emotions, to be comfortable that you are having emotions, or comfortable around other people who are having emotions. And women led in so many of the agencies and so many of the places. And that was another thing that I really recognized. And then the last thing is, you could tell people who had been through some trauma before, personal trauma, family trauma, community trauma. But there were people who were paralyzed by this incident, and there were people who were drawn to lead in this incident, and it had nothing to do with their titles. Zero to do with their titles, and everything to do with personal experience. And I don't know, chutzpah, like, right? Like, there's something, there's je ne sais quoi of it all, but it was really impressive. And so don't hesitate. What is it that Mr. Rogers says? Like, look to the quiet places and on the side. And it was that. Someone asked a specific question, and I think end with this, but what physical barriers do we use to protect open air event spaces? Do this in conversation with your emergency response services, but police cars, it's a twofer. Like, you can put up a lot of barriers, the Jersey barriers, or the big orange water sand filled. And there's always a combination of those, but we block a street, and that street is blocked with a police car. It's bright, it's got lights, it's visible. If somebody plows into that car, then they did that, and it was a police car. And it is an established vehicle on site who can be part of a response. So it serves multiple purposes, and it's very visible. The other end, this is a one-way street. The under end of that street, we just use traditional barriers, and there is no police car, because this car is really like facing oncoming traffic. And so that's been kind of our go-to. Yeah. I appreciate you and the space.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Connecticut Main Street team and Savannah. I appreciate this.
Thank you. Thank you so much again, Shanna. You've just shared lots of invaluable information. It's something unfortunate in our world, but we so appreciate you sharing your experience today so that we can be better prepared going forward. You have another outstanding information. Thank you so much in the comments. I'm going to close out with just a few remarks, and I'm going to share my screen. Okay. We invite you to join the more than 80 communities around the state committed to improving their Main Street by becoming a member of Connecticut Main Street Center. As a member, you receive exclusive help and resources to support your downtown work. Please visit connecticutmainstreet.org to learn more. Registration is now open for our next Spotlight on Maine. On May 1st, please join us in New Britain from 3 to 6 p.m. and you can register now at ctmainstreet.org/events. Registration is also now open for our May webinar, Beyond the Curb, the key elements to a successful Main Street streetscape. Join us from 11 a.m. to 12 noon on May 15th, and you can also register there at ctmainstreet.org/events. Save the date and stay tuned for more information on our brand new event, State of Maine, and that's happening on June 18th at the Mattituck Museum in Waterbury. Once again, we thank our sponsors and program partners. When you exit this webinar, you should be prompted to complete an evaluation for this presentation. Please take a minute to share your thoughts as it helps us to shape our programming so it is most valuable to you. That concludes today's webinar. Have a great day.